July 4th, 1776 is considered America's birthday. But given what we know about America's roots enslaving Black people and building systems of oppression after slavery was abolished, I think it's time for a rebirth. My name is Nona Jones, and I am the founder of the Faith and Prejudice movement. Nathan Rutstein once said that prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance. The Faith and Prejudice movement exists to demonstrate our faith in God through the work of confronting and dismantling racism in America. This broadcast special features civil rights leaders, theologians, scholars, and advocates who have dedicated their lives and work to racial equity. I invite you to listen and learn so that we can mobilize our collective energy toward lasting change in this country.
Hi, I'm Jenny Lesko with Fresh Life Church, and it is an honor to get to partner with Faith and Prejudice, and as a church to be able to lean in and to stand up and rise up and be a part of speaking out what God's heart is for justice and to end racism in this country. And I just believe that this is such an important thing for us as a church. As I've been learning, honestly, I've been so just humbled and aware of the fact that I haven't been aware of racism in our country. And growing up, I didn't know what our Black community, our Black brothers and sisters, people of color have gone through in the history of this country. And learning that the church generally in our history didn't stand up for people who didn't have a voice. We as a church didn't rise up in strength and honor and speak out about this racial injustice that has been happening since the beginning of our country. And it's been a joy to meet with Nona and the people who are a part of this Faith and Prejudice crew. I just believe that we are going to see a strengthening individually in our own hearts, and also in the life of our church, locally, individually, but also as a church together, as we take the place that God's called us to speak out and to honor all races, all cultures, all colors, knowing that in heaven, we are all together, all tribes, all nations, all cultures, going to be worshiping God together, equally. And so right now we get to practice on earth what is in heaven. And so I'm honored personally. I'm honored that we as a church get to be a part of this. And I just believe that change is going to happen now, launching us into the future for what God has for us as a country. And I'm honored to be a part of it.
Hey everyone, Eric and Candace here, senior pastors from Bethel in Redding, California. We're really excited about something that's coming up. We're partnering with hundreds of churches across our country to gather together, to come together, to learn, to grow, and to see racism eradicated from our country. And we want to invite you to be a part of it.
This is a turning moment for us that we get the privilege to be a part of, and we are all in. We are going after this and asking for the love of God to grow richer in us and through us, and that we're saying fully yes to Him and to each other. And we are excited about this turning, and it is time. It's time for us to put on love, to put on humility and compassion, and actually look at each other and learn. We want to grow in this moment and grow into the fullness of Christ. And that's us being one. And our prayer is that God would unite us in this time, and that we would take ownership for who God is inside of us, but also for who He's placed around us. And so we just would love for you to join us in this journey.
And I just want to encourage us too to be humble, to come in with humble hearts, come in with a desire to learn. And then honestly, how can we all make a dent in this conversation and see racism eradicated from our country and from the world? And so be a part of something and be on the right side of history on this, and join us for this amazing, amazing event. We'll see you guys soon.
On Memorial Day of this year, the world watched a man named George Floyd get murdered by a police officer who kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds as he begged and said, "I can't breathe." Right now in America, blacks are almost 3 times more likely than whites to be killed by police. This statistic often gets explained away via the assumption that blacks are more likely to be criminal, but the evidence doesn't support this claim. In the Stanford Open Policing Report that analyzed more than 200 million traffic stops and searches across the country, they found that even after controlling for age and gender, blacks were stopped and searched at higher rates than whites and Hispanics. The United States Sentencing Commission found that black men who commit the same crime as white men receive federal prison sentences that are nearly 20% longer. Tonight, I am joined by 2 guests who have dedicated their lives to advancing justice and equity for black and brown people at risk of incarceration and those incarcerated. Our first conversation is with Karol Mason, president of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. Karol is also the former Assistant United States Attorney General for Justice Programs, where her $4 billion budget was focused on keeping black and brown youth out of the juvenile justice system. She joins us tonight to help us listen and learn about the criminal injustice system in America. Karol, before we get into this conversation, and I'm so grateful for you to be joining us, I would love for you to actually introduce yourself, beyond the credentials and the degrees.
Well, thank you for having me on this program. I view this as a wonderful opportunity. So there's something you probably don't know. I am the granddaughter of a Baptist preacher from North Carolina, and the niece of an evangelical preacher from Columbus, Ohio. And so for me, I grew up understanding the power of the church. I remember my grandfather died when I was 12, and I remember being at his funeral. We grew up in New York, and we came south for the funeral, and having the mayor of Rocky Mount, North Carolina, tell stories about my grandfather and about the power of preachers in the South, particularly black preachers in the South. And this was still, during the times in the 70s, early 70s. And I remember them telling stories about how granddad would, if he saw some injustice happening, he would go down to talk to the mayor, police chief, and rectify it. So I come at this work understanding the power of the church to make differences. And I am a proud United Methodist, former Sunday school teacher and Bible study teacher. So I know the power of the audience that we have here today to really make a difference on these issues.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'm gonna have to ask you to preach in a minute, just so we can test your credentials.
One other thing I wanted, don't do that. One thing I also want to point out that I didn't know until I was in my 40s doing a birthday album, sister who was turning 50, and I interviewed my parents, and that's when I understood the sacrifice they made so I could have the opportunity to be here today. So my mother had 2 master's degrees. She went to graduate school at Clark Atlanta University. It was just Atlanta University then. She's a proud Bennett College graduate and has a master's from NYU, because back at the time, states would rather pay for black graduates to go to graduate school out of state rather than let them go to their state schools. But when they moved to New York, my father has a BS in nursing and a public health master's. She wasn't allowed to teach on Long Island because they didn't have black teachers. So the NAACP sued for her to be able to teach, and I'm going to tear up at this. I didn't know this until my 40s. 2 years she worked as a domestic with 2 master's degrees because she wasn't allowed to teach so that I could have a better opportunity. So that's why these issues are powerful to me, and that education is the cornerstone to me of change, and religion paired together. Really, we can really do some things.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. You have accomplished a tremendous amount, which I think is, to your point, it's a credit to your parents and their sacrifice and their work. You became the first Black woman in America to chair the management committee of a major law firm. What was that experience like? I can't even begin to imagine.
So it was interesting. I went to law school thinking I was going to be part of a social justice movement. Mm-hmm. And wound up being part of a different kind of movement. When I got to law school, I found out there were these things called lodge law firms, which I didn't know existed. And so I went to work for Alston & Bird at that time. And for me, I was just plugging along year after year because I I was of a generation that felt like if you had an opportunity to break through a barrier, it was your obligation to do it. So, so I was the first Black woman to become a partner there, the first one to be on the management committee, and the first one to chair it. And I just felt like it was my responsibility. And it was interesting to be in the room. This was well before Hamilton, where we learned the phrase to be in the room when it's happening. But I remember one voice can change a conversation, and not just my voice. But I remember instances where I would be in the room with, I was the only woman and the only person of color. And I would say something and they'd go on with the conversation. And then one of my white partners would say the exact same thing and they'd listen. But I was in the room and I would say, no, I just said the same thing he said. Why is it different now? And so I am lucky that I had the, I always tell young people, make sure you're in a position that you can walk away from your job if you have to. And so I had the comfort of knowing that I was okay using my voice, because if I lost my job, I would be okay. But I have to tell you this one quick story. So I believe in tithing. And for partners, you don't get paid unless the firm makes a certain amount of money. And I would always tithe no matter what. And my partners, when I would tell them how I could, little I could live off, they were like, how do you do that? And it's because I believe in tithing.
Oh my gosh. I can't even imagine. But I appreciate you actually living out your faith in those difficult seasons. I want to talk about something that you said. I've known you for years now. You're such an incredible person and such a mentor and inspiration to me. You once said that the criminal justice system is essentially like the byproduct of all of the broken systems before it. Can you just unpack that for people who don't understand what that means?
So I know that you talked in your introduction about juveniles, so I'm going to talk about it from that perspective. We all make mistakes. That's how we grow. That's how we develop. That's how we learn. I tell people, if you're not making mistakes, you're not growing. And so the challenge we have for our Black and brown children in particular is we don't give them the space to make mistakes and having a support system around them so they can make mistakes and still succeed. I like to ask people when I'm giving talks, who can raise your hand that you never did anything wrong when you were growing up? I had one person raise their hand and she said she was a preacher's kid. And I said, and I know you're lying. Because my father was a preacher's kid and I know he made mistakes. But I think that the challenge is we haven't made the investments we need to make in not just young people, but our communities. And I'm sure we'll get into this more later, but I think the challenge is that we're asking policing to do things that aren't meant to be done by police. Mm-hmm. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in job creation. We need to invest in making sure everybody has health care. There are things that we can make investments in so that our communities are thriving and everybody has an opportunity to survive, not just thrive, opportunity to thrive. And I think what's happened is because those other investments haven't been made, people make choices, and the other thing is our default response is to call the police. Mm. And that should not be our default response. Our default response ought to be, how can I support you? What's going on in your life? What's happening? Why are you making these choices? So that we can figure out where the systems need to be to support someone's success, particularly our young people.
This is really important to me personally, because, when we first met, I was speaking at a conference that you were hosting, and I shared how, when I was growing up, I was acting out. I was disruptive in class, and I would get punished. I would get sent to the principal's office, and no one ever asked why was I behaving that way. But if they had only asked, they would have learned that I was being sexually abused and physically abused, but nobody asked. And so I want to just kind of double click into the intersection of the education system and the juvenile justice system for a moment. There's been a documented disparity, empirically studied disparity between the way Black and brown children are disciplined in school and the way that white children are disciplined in school. Can you share why that even matters?
But see, so that's, again, the whole conversation about giving room to make mistakes and grow. And so, I think that there are many reasons why it happens. But what schools have become for too many Black and brown children is, I hate the phrase, but the school to prison pipeline. And instead, what we want is a supportive model a supportive discipline model. That doesn't mean you don't hold people accountable when they make mistakes, but you do it in a way that's supportive of the ultimate goal, which is to educate them so that they have an opportunity to really contribute to their communities. And so I think the challenge for us is giving space to make mistakes. And so I heard something interesting on one of the news programs yesterday. Actually, I probably shouldn't say the name of the news program, but it was an interview with John Legend. And he said that the challenge for those of us who are have young people in our lives, is young people of color, is they get to a certain age and size where they become, just by their mere presence, threatening to other people. And I think that's the thing that's an aha moment. I could see the reaction in the audience, some of the folks, when they heard him say that. They're like, oh, and it's not that the child has done anything other than grow up into a body that then feels threatening to other people. And so I think the challenge for us is to recognize what's happening with us and not necessarily what's happening with the child. But also, again, have the goal of giving that child space to grow. One of my favorite stories is when we were trying to talk to police officers who were in schools about how to approach children and what their role was. There was this wonderful officer in Philadelphia who told the story about how the teacher called the school resource officer into the room because this one young man wouldn't lift his head off the desk. And so this officer was so smart, he went down and he knelt next to the young man and he said, "What's happening? What's going on?" And it turned out his best friend had just been shot and murdered the night before. And he was in pain, in grief. And that simple question, what's wrong? What's happening? Instead of yanking him out of the classroom, and I think we need to do more of that understanding. And one of the things I hear young people tell me when I was at the Office of Justice Programs, one of the things I learned was ask the people you want to help what they need and what they want. And so I encourage people to actually spend time with young people and ask them, how can you support them? What do you need from us? And one of the things that they said that has stuck with me is that stop calling us at risk and start calling us at hope. Because your expectations for them really have an impact on how they see themselves and how what opportunities they have to live their lives.
That's so good. And that's so rich. And I think you made a comment once about how the majority of, criminal and juvenile justice issues are really at the state and the local level. And so sometimes it seems like, it's just such a big issue and it's so distant, but it's truly right in our backyard. And I'd love your thoughts on, for people who are watching this, who are like, okay, maybe I should try to help. Maybe I should try to support. How can they do that?
So one of my favorite stories about getting this role at John Jay is before I even got to be the president of John Jay, I wanted people to understand that most of the criminal justice reform work and the justice work happens at the state and local level, not at the federal level. So with some of my colleagues, we started organizing a Smart on Crime Innovations Conference that's very bipartisan across the political spectrum, because we all share the same goal of wanting to create healthy communities. And I didn't have a job. But when we started planning it, and thankfully I got the job at John Jay so that we could have the conference at John Jay. And the fourth year of it starts tomorrow. But one of the things we wanted people to understand is the power they have at the state and local level. Grassroots organizations, nonprofits, churches, partnering with the police in their communities, local governments, and making the changes, because that's where the change happens. The majority of our criminal justice issues are at the state and local level. The amount of folks who are charged and criminally prosecuted in the federal system is minor compared to what happens across the country.
So it sounds like people can affect change, even though it seems like, oh my gosh, this is a huge issue. And, it's so distant for me. It sounds like people can affect change. I want to talk a little bit, because I think this issue of the juvenile justice system is so key as kind of a starting point into the criminal justice system. I'd love to talk about recidivism. Having worked in the juvenile justice space for a few years, I know that the probability of reoffending is incredibly high. Can you talk to why that is? Why recidivism is so high?
So I would say, I would flip the question and say, we know a lot from research what works that keeps people. And, as the president of an institution for higher education, research is critical to me. And I think that for all of us, we want to figure out where do we make our investments. And we know that education, jobs, connection to family and community are critical in keeping people out of our criminal justice system. So on the front end, the former head of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention used to say that for young people, the contact with the criminal justice system ought to be rare, fair, and helpful. And so I think that we need to, again, reframe who ought to be in the criminal justice system. Accountability for young people or anybody. Again, the default should not be jail. That should not be your default. The default should be what resources do I need to give this child? So education is key. Keeping them in school. When I was growing up, I've had this question my entire life. Why do you expel children or suspend children from school when where you want them is in school? Because that's where you have an opportunity to impact their life in a favorable way. So you ought to be figuring out what resources do we need to bring to bear to keep them in school and getting education, because we know, all the life outcome data about if you stay in school, your life outcomes are so much better. We know that access to jobs and having job opportunities is key and critical, and supporting families. One of the biggest lessons I got was when I was at the Department of Justice was learning that children of incarcerated parents still want a relationship with their parents and ought to have a relationship with their parents. Just because you made a mistake that caused you to be incarcerated doesn't mean that you ought to lose your right to be your parent, nor should the child lose that connection to the parent. And so even short, I think we ought to be investing in shoring up family structures and supporting families. I know the Annie Casey Foundation and the Casey Family Programs do a lot of work around this, keeping young people out of the foster care system and supporting them with families. Those are the important things and that's right for the church to do. Again, go and ask your foster care system, your schools, how can we support your students who are most in need? And I think that's an easy role to play, and it's right there in your own backyard.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on the question I wanted to ask you, because we have a lot of people watching who are, they're members of churches, but they're also members of, civic organizations. And one of the things I've admired you so many ways, but one of the things I've always admired about you is that you're building coalitions in order to address this and advance change. When you think about the church and these systems that they're not, let's be clear, they're not broken. They were built the way that they are.
They were intended.
They were intended. How can the church move from a place of kind of knowing about these issues to acting on these issues collectively?
Yeah. So I think the start is the church ought to be civically engaged and really talking with the leadership of their communities, the mayors, the police chiefs, the school superintendents, the health commissioners in the state, in the communities, and saying, what are you doing to support the success of people in our community? And how can we help? And asking, because I think the key thing is asking the people who you want to help what help looks like to them, rather than thinking, which I had made the mistake of many times in investing my money through the Department of Justice, of delivering what I thought was needed. And I totally changed the paradigm when I actually began to ask, what do you need? And community by community, that's really different. And so, for example, I know that T.D. Jakes and his ministry works a lot with people who were formerly incarcerated and helping them get back on their feet and get jobs and supporting them. And they've got great success. And what I encourage people to do, if you develop a program, keep data to see whether it's effective and whether it's working. Don't keep putting money into something that's not working. And if you're watching the data and it's not working, pivot, question it, check it. But there are things you can do. For example, we know that after school programs that are rigorous, so that young people, when the school day is over, they've got a place where they can go and they continue to study, continue to learn. It's a safe environment. Have some fun too. That works. There are some programs where I know that San Francisco used to have a program where all of the police recruits, as part of the academy, worked at a local youth development program. I'm not saying names, so I'm not advertising anybody's program. And it had a threefold benefit. One, the police chief could see how these officers interact with young people. Two, it dispelled any notions the officers coming in might have had about the young people in these tough neighborhoods. And it dispelled the notions the young people had about the officers coming into their community. So it was building those relationships, building those partnerships from a young age. And also, fourthly, hopefully some of those young folks would go into law enforcement because they saw it as something they want to be. And I think it's important for us to think of law enforcement not as an us versus them, but a we, because officers are part of the community. They should be serving the communities in which they work. And that's one of the things, as the president of John Jay, which started as a police college, that I am focused on, making sure that we're graduating officers out onto the street who want to partner with their communities.
It's so funny you would say that. I was running this morning, and as I was thinking about even this conversation, it occurred to me that somehow we have set up a false dichotomy. Like, we have to either support the police or support the protesters, when in fact, like you just said, it's us. Like, right. We have to figure out, how do we operate together as a society? Right. And to your credit, I mean, what you're basically doing, as you said, is you are raising you're raising up the next generation of law enforcement officers and
the people who will protest against them. Yes, because that's our motto. We're raising fierce advocates for justice, and you ought to be a fierce advocate for justice no matter what your role is in the community. And I love that our officers are going to have firsthand experience with the people who are protesting again, may protest again. Hopefully, because of those relationships, they won't have the need to protest. Because
as you're kind of working with this next generation, what is your hope that you're instilling in them, that you want your faculty and your staff to instill in them? Because you're right, like you're basically touching everyone on all sides. So what is it that you want them to leave John Jay with?
I want them to leave with a sense of understanding how important it is to care for everybody else, and to understand that they are particularly law enforcement officers. They're given a special responsibility, a special authority, and they need to exercise it with love and with great care. And I'm hoping that I'm raising up a generation who will go out with the moral fiber to be able to say, no, that's not right. Here's how we ought to be doing it. Whether you're the first day on the job or 25 years on the job, that they have this strong sense of what's right, and to support a community. I know that as Christians, we believe in love. That's the one instruction we got that's supposed to surpass all of the others. And the question is, how do we live out that love? And to me, that's where the role of the church is looking at, okay, I say this, I say I'm Christian, and I say that I follow Jesus' teaching. So what does that mean? What does that love look like? And that love can look like, creating an after-school program. That love can look like holding our schools accountable for making sure our students stay in school. That love can look like investing and saying we want resources put into education so that we can level the playing field, so that it doesn't matter which zip code you're in, what the quality of your educational experience is. It means having opportunities for our young people to have experiential learning where they're equipped for the jobs that are out there. So the love to me is like, how do you act on it? How does it manifest itself? And I think that that's what the churches can be doing and should be doing.
Karol, this is so good and so rich. I want to ask you just this last question, just as you kind of watch what's happening in our country now. What are you praying for? What are you praying about? And how can we, as a body, join you in prayer at this time?
So you're going to make me tear up. Because I've been praying before this conversation started, to say, how do you want me to use my voice, God? And I think that my prayer is that we use this moment and we get it right this time. I am 62 years old, and I've seen this before, and I don't want to see it again. I want us to really commit to not just seeing each other, but loving each other at a deep level, that we want to do right by each other. And that doesn't mean we have to agree with each other on some issues, but it means we ought to love each other and respect each other and want to see each other succeed. Because when we all have an opportunity to succeed, we all thrive and we all do much better. And I'd love people to be able to understand. And that's why I am so glad that you decided to have this conversation, because I think that we ought to demystify each other and really see the humanity in each other. So that's my prayer, is that we have an opportunity to really live out our faith and really act on that faith and really see each other as fellow human beings that we love and want to help and support and be successful, and not let the noise of how we may differ on certain issues disrupt us from being supportive and loving Christians.
Amen. Amen. Karol, you can preach at my church any day. You are such a blessing. And I just pray for God's favor to just continue to be on your work, on your life. You have truly encouraged and challenged, I think, all of us. And so I think on behalf of everyone watching, I just want to say thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your voice. And thank you for joining us.
And I just want to say thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to people that I might not otherwise have an opportunity to meet. So thank you.
Our next conversation is with Bryan Stevenson. Bryan is the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative and has dedicated his life to advocating for the voiceless people stuck in the criminal justice system, many of whom have been condemned to death and were found innocent through his work. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Just Mercy, a book that was recently turned into a film. He joins us tonight to help us listen and learn about the role of mercy in justice. Bryan, such an honor and a privilege to have you with us for this week of education, inspiration, and mobilization. You truly are, and I believe you exemplify what it means to be someone who's committed to leading change. But before we get into the questions I prepared, I would love it if you could just introduce yourself beyond, the credentials, the degrees, the amazing work you've done. Tell us about your family and how they shaped your perspective on humanity.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And it's an honor to be with you. I grew up in a poor, racially segregated community. It was at the end of the Jim Crow era, so I started my education in a colored school. Black people were marginalized, Black people were excluded, people were hardworking, but that wasn't always valued and rewarded. And the experience of kind of growing up on the margins definitely had an impact on me. I'm the great-grandchild of people who were enslaved. My people were enslaved in Virginia. My grandmother fled the South to go to the North during the time of lynching and terrorism. And she was a powerful influence for me. My grandmother taught me the importance of kind of caring about things deeply. When integration came, she was worried. And she started doing this thing where she would give me these hugs, and she would squeeze me really hard. And an hour later, she would see me and she'd say, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again. And by the time I was 10, my grandmother had taught me every time I would see her, the first thing I would say is, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she would smile this smile. She worked as a domestic her whole life. She lived into her 90s. And when she got in her 90s, she fell one day. She broke her hip. And she was then diagnosed with cancer. And she was dying. And I went to go see her. I was in college at the time. And it was really hard to imagine a world without my grandmother. And I was just sitting next to her. And I was just pouring my heart out, saying all these things, holding her hand. Her eyes were closed. I wasn't even sure she could hear what I was saying. And I knew it was time to go. And I stood up to leave. And just before I left, my grandmother opened her eyes. And then she squeezed my hand. And the last thing she said to me, she said, "Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I want you to know I'm always going to be hugging you." And I have felt the embrace of my grandmother and my family my entire life. And it shaped me because I believe that if we want to make a difference in the world, if we want to make change in the world, we have to get close enough to people who are suffering and excluded and neglected and marginalized, that when we are called to do so, we can wrap our arms around them and affirm their humanity and affirm their dignity. And it is that kind of nurturing and guidance and love that my family gave me that has shaped my work. I've wanted to get close to the condemned, to the imprisoned, to embrace them and to affirm their humanity and dignity because they get so much hatred and animosity. And so it's very much been a part of what has shaped my work, and I feel really privileged to be the product of love, to be the shaped by that love, despite all the kind of the inequality and injustice that's also part of that story. But I feel really blessed by the family that I was born into.
Wow. With your brilliance and your savvy, you could have easily left law school and gone into a major corporation or done something of that nature. And yet you've often said that you basically have spent your life, working in jails and prisons, working with people, as you said, who have been condemned to die by the justice system. Can you tell everyone, what was it about your first visit to death row as a law student in 1983 that put you on this path that you've been on for the last 30 years?
Yeah, well, I wasn't really clear about what I wanted to do. I was a philosophy major in college. Nobody told me until my senior year that I wasn't going to get paid to philosophize when I graduated. And I started looking into graduate programs. And because I was a first generation college student, nobody in my family had gone to college, I didn't realize that if you go to graduate school in history or English or political science, you need to know something about history, English, or political science. And so I kind of fell into law because it became clear to me you don't need to know anything to go to law school. And I ended up at Harvard's law school, and I was deeply disillusioned by my time there in the first year because it seemed like nobody was really talking about race or inequality or injustice. And I did a joint program with the School of Government and then ended up back at the law school. And it was during that year that I took a course that required me to spend a month with a human rights organization. I went to Georgia. I went to work with these lawyers providing legal services to people on death row. They asked me to go to death row and meet somebody who they hadn't had time to meet and just explain to him that he wasn't at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that was a transformative moment for me because I was so unprepared. I felt so inadequate to be in that space as a law student. And I went to the visitation room and they brought this condemned man in, and he was burdened with chains. He had handcuffs on his wrist. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. And they unchained him. And I was so nervous that I just began to apologize. And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know much about the death penalty. I don't know anything about criminal procedure or appellate procedure." I said, "But they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year." And as soon as I said those words, the man grabbed my hand and he said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." He said, "You're the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard." He said, "I've been talking to my wife and my kids and I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid they'd show up and I'd have an execution date." He said, "Now because of you, I'm going to see my wife, I'm going to see my kids." And I couldn't really make sense of the fact that even in my ignorance, by just being present in that place and giving that man those words, it had had an impact. And we started talking, and turned out we were exactly the same age. And we spent the next 3 hours talking. I'd only scheduled to be there an hour, but we just got lost in conversation. And it was so affirming and so inspiring. And after 3 hours, the guards got angry that I hadn't ended the visit. And so they came bursting into the room and they were really mad and they couldn't do anything to me. So they took it out on this man and they threw him against the wall. They pulled his arms back. They put the handcuffs on his wrist very tightly. They were just being really rough with him. They wrapped the chain around his waist. They put the shackles back on his ankles. I begged them to be gentler, but they ignored me. And then they started shoving this man toward the door. And I never will forget when he got near the door, he planted his feet. And when they tried to shove him out of the room, he didn't move. And this man looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then he did something I've never forgotten. He stood there, he closed his eyes, he threw his head back, and he started to sing. He started singing a hymn. And he started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. And when I heard that, everything just seemed to change. The guard stopped. Everybody stopped. And then the guards recovered and they started pushing him down the hallway. And you could hear the chains clanging, but you could also hear this man singing about higher ground. And when I heard that man sing, everything changed for me. That was the moment when I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. And it changed my relationship to the law. I went back to Harvard Law School. You couldn't get me out of the law school library because I needed to know everything about the jurisprudence necessary to help condemned people get to higher ground. And I tell people often, if you ask me, well, how have you been able to help people? What have you done? What's your secret? Blah, blah. It's not that I've worked hard. I have. It's not that I've done a lot of study. I have. It's not that I'm smart or anything like that. If you really want to know how I've been able to do some of the things I've done, it's because I got proximate. I got close to a condemned man and heard him sing about higher ground. And when we put ourselves in positions like that, we hear things that we won't otherwise hear. We see things that we won't otherwise see. And it had an impact on me, on my beliefs, right? It just changed. And that was the moment when I recognized that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. That's when I realized that if someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If someone takes something, they're not just a thief. Even if you kill someone, you're not just a killer. And I believe we are called to understand the other things that people are and recognize the power of what people are and speak to redemption and speak to transformation. So yeah, it was a very formative moment for me.
Wow, this is powerful, Bryan. This idea of getting proximate is so key. And I think one of the ways, especially in this climate, where people can get proximate to issues of injustice is through education, especially, I would say, the white population that has, in many ways, been able to live kind of adjacent to, but not in the Black experience. You have represented clients who were given life without parole for things like stealing a bike, possession of marijuana. And you said that you can't understand this practice of mass incarceration without understanding the legacy of slavery. I would love it if you could help educate people on why those are two related experiences.
Yeah, I think we do have to get closer to the history of this country and how we came to be in this moment. And we haven't done a very good job in educating people about this. We've tried to look away. We've tried to avoid talking about things for generations. And that silence, that indifference to understanding has caused us to live in a nation where I don't think we're free. I think we're burdened by a history of racial inequality, a history of racial justice that's kind of created a kind of smog in the air, and we all breathe it in, and it creates distrust and confusion and all of these things. So I do think we need to understand who we are. We are a post-genocide society. What we did to indigenous people, native people, when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. We killed millions of indigenous people through famine and war and disease. We didn't call it genocide. We instead called those people savages. And we used this narrative of racial difference to justify abuse of that population. And we created a constitution that talked about equality and justice for all and liberty, but we didn't apply that to these indigenous people because we saw them as different. And it was that narrative of racial difference that then got us comfortable with 2.5 centuries of slavery. And I think the true evil of American slavery wasn't just the bondage. It wasn't the involuntary servitude. It wasn't the forced labor. The true evil was this ideology we created that said that Black people aren't as good as white people. Black people are less deserving. Black people are less worthy. Black people aren't fully human. And that ideology was created because enslavers, to feel moral and Christian and just, had to create a narrative that made Black people something different. And that ideology of white supremacy, that was the real evil of slavery. And we fought the Civil War. And at the end of the war, we passed the 13th Amendment. But the 13th Amendment doesn't talk about narratives of racial difference. It doesn't talk about the ideology of white supremacy. So I've argued that slavery doesn't really end in 1865. It just evolves. It becomes a century where Black people are terrorized and menaced and burdened and threatened, pulled out of their homes and beaten and hanged and tortured. And that era of lynching and terrorism, we haven't really talked about. Older people of color come up to me sometimes and they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being bombed and lynched and menaced every day of our lives. The Black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland, Boston and Minneapolis didn't go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And we haven't acknowledged that. We've been silent about that. And even in the 50s and 60s, when heroic, faithful Black folks, supported by some white folks, fought against Jim Crow and segregation, and they would put on their Sunday best and go places, and they would be literally praying for civil rights when they would get beaten and battered and bloodied by police and law enforcement. Even in that moment when we passed the civil rights laws and the voting rights laws, we never reckoned with this narrative of racial difference, this ideology. And so we're still living today in spaces where that narrative exists. And you can be a talented tech innovator. You can be a person of faith. You can be a teacher, an educator, or a lawyer, a doctor. Doesn't matter what you are. If you're Black or brown, you go places in this country where you have to navigate these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. And it starts to weigh on you. I've gotten old enough now that I can tell you that when you have to keep navigating through these things, I've argued cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. And I've still gone into small courtrooms in the Midwest where I have my suit and tie on to do a hearing, and I show up and the judge has come out and looked at me and gotten angry and said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. You wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And then I have to apologize and say, oh, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I'm the lawyer. And the judge will start laughing and the prosecutor will start laughing. And I'll have to laugh too, because I don't want to disadvantage my client, who's much more vulnerable than I am. And so I'll laugh. And the client will come in and we'll do this hearing. And afterward, I have to make peace with the fact that in this country, despite all of these things I've had to do, I have to laugh at my own humiliation to create an environment that might allow justice to come to my client. And when you have to keep doing these things, you get tired, you get exhausted. And so that's why I believe it is so urgent and necessary that we reckon with this history. In other countries, in South Africa and Rwanda and Germany, there was a reckoning with histories of apartheid and genocide and Holocaust. In Germany, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers and stones placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. There's a Holocaust memorial in the center of Berlin. People are required to go there. Students are required to go there. Police officers are required to go there. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. But in this country, I live in a region littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. And nobody wants to talk about race. Nobody wants to talk about slavery. Nobody wants to talk about this legacy. We act as if we just want to forget about it. And we can't, because the legacy of these things are here with us. So I really do believe we need an era of truth and justice. I appreciate what you're doing, because I actually think people of faith have a critical role in facilitating this era, because we're supposed to understand what the power of repentance and confession. We fear in this country acknowledging the things we've done wrong because we fear judgment. We fear condemnation. And in my faith tradition, I'm taught that mercy triumphs over judgment. If we confess, if we repent, on the other side of that is redemption and restoration. And we need to model that for this nation, because until we commit to truth and justice, we can't get free. And the good news is that there is something better waiting for us. There's something that feels more like freedom, more like equality, more like justice. But we can't get there if we're unwilling to go through this process of confession and repentance, of truth-telling that yields redemption and restoration. And so, yes, I actually think this is an urgent, critical moment in this country, that if we have the courage of our convictions, that maybe we can have something transformational happen that leads us to a different place. But we are going to have to reckon with this history.
Well, let me say, I'm going to start calling you Bishop Dr. Bryan Stevenson, because you just preached a sermon right there. And I'm so grateful for it, because you're right. You know, there is no progress without acknowledgement. Like, you have to acknowledge. And I think that's been absent from this entire experience of being Black in America. Something else that I think I'd love for you to unpack is there are many people who think that if a person is incarcerated, it's because of guilt, like they did something wrong. But I remember when I was watching Just Mercy, amazing movie, amazing book, it depicted the fact that there are people who are actually incarcerated due to a lack of legal representation. Could you just share more about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, something radical happened in our country 50, 60 years ago. Throughout most of the 20th century, our prison population was pretty stable. It was less than 200,000 people. And then in the early 1970s, we declared this misguided war on drugs. And we decided to treat people who are drug addicted or drug dependent as criminals and use the criminal justice system to manage that population. Now, we could have said that people with addiction and dependency have a health problem and we need a healthcare response to that problem, but we used a criminal justice response. And so the prison population began skyrocketing. And we went from 300,000 people in jails and prisons in the early 70s to over 2.2 million people in jails and prisons today. And we didn't build an infrastructure that was needed to make sure people were being properly treated, properly convicted, fairly represented. And at the same time we declared this misguided war on drugs, we started engaging in what I call the politics of fear and anger and imposing really harsh, extreme sentences on different kinds of people. And that's how we started putting young children in adult jails and prisons, imposing life without parole sentences for nonviolent crimes. States eliminated the minimum age for trying children as adults. We've got 13 states where there's no minimum age for trying children as adults. So I've represented 9 and 10-year-old kids facing 40 and 50-year prison sentences. I've represented 13-year-old children sentenced to die in prison. And that environment gave rise to a lot of excessive, harsh punishment, but also gave rise to a lot of error, because we didn't provide people with the resources they needed to defend themselves when they've been wrongly accused. And so we've created a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And there are thousands of innocent people in our jails and prisons because they can't get the legal help they need. And that's at the heart of the stories that I tell in Just Mercy and that you see in the film. But it's an epidemic of wrongful convictions because we've otherized people to the point where we think that if you're poor, if you're Black, or you're undocumented, that you're presumptively guilty. And the state doesn't have to prove your guilt. They just have to show you to these decision makers. And it's one of the reasons why we are in desperate need of reforming this system. Because when we allow ourselves to be governed by fear and anger, we tolerate things we shouldn't tolerate. Fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice and oppression and abuse. If you go anywhere in the world where people are being abused, if you ask the abusers why they do that, they can give you a narrative of fear and anger. And that's why I believe that hope and healing and transformation have to be the mechanisms for confronting this system. But we've now identified 165 people who have been sentenced to death who are innocent, who were exonerated. And that means that for every 9 people we've executed in this country, we've identified 1 innocent person on death row, which is a shameful rate of error. And if somebody said to you, 1 out of 9 apples in the grocery store is toxic, and if you touch it, you'll die, nobody would buy apples. Nobody would sell apples. But we continue to tolerate this error in the death penalty in our criminal justice system because I don't think we've actually understood the pain and the anguish. And that's one of the reasons why I think there is such an urgent need that we get close enough to this issue, to these communities, to people, that we recognize the harm we are doing and we make changes.
You once said something so powerful. You said that you feel the power of God most intensely when you serve the condemned, the incarcerated, the discarded, the disfavored. In the book, Just Mercy, you talk about these ideas of mercy and justice. And I would love if you could just share what is mercy and what is justice?
Yeah, well, I mean, in my faith tradition, I think a lot about transformation, right? So in the Christian faith, we have all of these. The scriptures are created by letters from the Apostle Paul, and his writings become an important part of how we think about faith. And people forget that before Paul was the Apostle Paul, he was the convicted criminal Saul. And in our society today, he wouldn't be given the opportunity to become this great apostle, because we condemn and we judge. And when I left death row for the first time, I thought about what it would mean to have to defend Saul so he can become Paul. And that absence of potential, of redemption, has really shaped my work. I believe we are called to do more than judge, to do more than condemn. The prophet Micah talks about this. The question is posed, what does God require of us? And in chapter 6, verse 8, Micah says, what God requires is that we do justice, that we love mercy, and that we walk humbly. And for me, that has animated the work that I try to do. We've gotten to the point in this country where we seem to not want to talk about mercy, and I just believe that we have to embrace it. That's why, I use that title for my book, and I feel God's grace and I feel God's power in community with the condemned and the incarcerated, because it's in those spaces where people have been pushed down so far. They have been crushed by judgment. They have been discarded and disfavored, excluded by these harsh judgments. And yet there is a yearning for redemption. There is a desire for restoration. And when you surround yourself with the condemned and the marginalized, the excluded, the people that Jesus surrounded himself by, and you feel this possibility for redemption and restoration, you begin to understand the power of faith to transform. You understand the power of redemption to lift up. It's in those spaces that I begin to recognize that I am called to stand even when people say sit down. I am called to speak even when people say be quiet, because there is this thing that must be expressed. We were taught that truth crushed to earth shall rise again. That is, in my faith, the model of what liberates us. And it is in proximity to the suffering that you begin to nurture something that will literally start feeling like fire shut up in your bones when you start to feel the need to transform, to confront inequality and injustice. And so, yes, I've been blessed. I've been privileged to do the work that I do because it has taught me the power of God's grace, the power of forgiveness, the power of redemption, the power of restoration, and the beauty of truth-telling when we have the courage to do it.
Now, for our last question in the last few minutes we have, I would love it if you could issue just a charge to the people of faith, the churches, the pastors who are watching this, so that they can understand how to best mobilize and support the mission of your work and the Equal Justice Initiative.
Sure. Well, I think four things. I believe the church needs to get proximate to the poor, the excluded, the neglected, the abused, the incarcerated. If you're not doing prison ministry, please start. If you're not doing jail ministry, please start. If you're not providing services to people coming out of jails and prisons, please do it. Jesus told us that we are called to feed the hungry, to clothe the poor, to minister to the sick, and to visit those in jail. I mean, it's part of the calling that we are. And I don't think the church has done that with the kind of commitment that it needs to. So getting proximate to those who are excluded and marginalized, I think, is the first thing. I think we have to change this narrative of racial difference. We have to commit to truth and justice in our institutions, because the church has sometimes been complicit in silence about inequality and racism. We've been complicit in not acknowledging and dealing with these things. I think each church needs to kind of tell its own story, confess its own sins with regard to not confronting bigotry and bias. We need to change this narrative. We need to hold up this idea that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. We need to become stone catchers in an era where people are casting stones at those who have offended. They're not heeding Christ's message, let him as without sin cast the first stone. They're just throwing them away. So we've got to stand in front of that, and that narrative has to be there. I think the third thing the church must do is we've got to be hopeful about what we can do. Sometimes it's easier to be faithful than to be hopeful, because we can get into ritual and practice without actually being hopeful that we can change things. We have to believe things we have not seen. We have to believe in creating an environment where people are not thrown away and condemned. We have to believe that we can end the scourge of violence that dominates so many communities. And I think that hopefulness is going to be key. And then lastly, I think the church has to be willing to do things that are uncomfortable and inconvenient. Faith should not be easy. It should not be without conflict and controversy, because if we are active in a world where there's suffering and inequality, we're going to have to do things that are uncomfortable and inconvenient. I look at the civil rights era. Those were people of faith who put themselves in uncomfortable and inconvenient spaces and sometimes were battered and bloodied for it. But it's through that ministry, through that witness, that the world started to shift. We need people to enter uncomfortable conversation, to do inconvenient things in service of a new day, a new kind of community, a beloved community, a community where there are no barriers to love and fellowship and restoration. And I just think that's going to mean getting active. We invite people to journey with us at the Equal Justice Initiative. There are lots of other organizations doing incredibly important and valuable work. But you have to get involved. This is no longer a time when we can remain silent about these critical issues of racial bias and over-incarceration and neglect of the poor and the abused. I think this is a moment of real transformation for our country, and I hope people of faith will respond.
Bryan, you are an absolute gift. Thank you for your work. Thank you so much for not giving up. I know this hasn't been easy at all, but it is so worth it. And so just thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. It's great to be with you.
How you doing? I'm Miles McPherson, pastor of the Rock Church in San Diego and author of The Third Option, Hope for a Racially Divided Nation. And we need hope. One of the most glaring examples of racial disparity in the nation is reflected in the criminal justice system. And any hope of meaningful transformation in that system must start with the transformation of the heart. Khalif Browder was a 16-year-old African-American man who was arrested for being accused of stealing a backpack. He spent 1,000 days in adult prison at Rikers Island and over 700 of those days in solitary confinement. He never had a trial, was not even charged. He attempted suicide multiple times and was finally let out without, even being charged. Shortly after being released, he killed himself. It is clear that there is a discrepancy of justice in our nation. If in fact all men are created equal and all possess the image of the same God, which is not only affirmed in the Declaration of Independence, but the Bible itself, why are the scales of justice weighed toward one group over another? Remember, racism is a spiritual issue. It is spiritual before it is legal or a criminal justice issue. Keep in mind that racism is seeing God's image in yourself as more valuable than in someone else whose skin color is different. This is problematic when you see yourself as more deserving than justice than someone who is black, or that by being black, they possess an inferior God image, simply because they are black. It is also problematic if you turn a blind eye to the injustices against those who are black because of some idea that they don't deserve the justice you expect for yourself. Injustice for one group is an offense to us all, and especially against God who made all of us in his image. Here's an eternal truth. Psalm 89:14 says, "Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you." Because every person is made in the image of God equally, every person equally deserves righteous judgment based on truth. How we live should reflect that. We should seek to protect the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as given by God. We should strive to create equitable justice for all people. So I have two questions. Do you judge people who look different than you with a different scale than those who look like you? Do you have less patience with people of color? Do you have less positive assumptions about people of color? This is the foundation of an imbalanced scale of justice. But recognize it is also the key to balancing them. Are you willing to allow a system of law with unbalanced scales based not on the equal image of God, but based on the biases against the color of someone's skin? As we prepare for the National Weekend of Action in 3 days, remember that racism is seeing another person as less than yourself. And that will inevitably result in an imbalanced scale of justice. So let me ask you a question. Is there a different scale of justice for those who are African American than those who look like you? If you don't think so, then please keep advocating for the justice of God in every person. But if you do think so, then listen carefully. You have a choice to make. You can either contribute to a culture of racism by arguing and defending your right to a different scale of justice than those who look different than you, or you can humbly accept that God's justice is not partial to skin color and contribute to a culture of unity and love where justice is given equally. As we transition into a time of prayer, spend a few minutes praying in these three areas. Ask God to forgive you of any sense of pride over anyone who is different than you. Ask God to help you see the image of God in every person. Ask God to lead you to heal any breach between your heart and the hearts of your African-American brothers and sisters. God bless you.
Hey, I'm Reggie Joyner, CEO of Orange, and our organization exists to influence those who influence the faith of the next generation. And we believe we are living in a defining moment in our history because of the conversations that are happening right now around race. As a white leader and pastor, I'm convinced that the way we respond to this issue is important for a lot of reasons. But here's one reason I want you to consider. There's a generation of kids and teenagers who will decide what they believe about God and the church based on how we respond to this issue of race. And that's why I'm so excited about so many of the conversations that are happening right now. And that's why I want to invite you to join Orange as we participate with key leaders around our country for a Faith and Prejudice masterclass. It will be a 4-week experience where you can learn from experts in the space of racial justice and reconciliation through weekly videos. You'll also be able to take part in constructive weekly conversations via Zoom with Nona Jones and other seasoned leaders. It's called Faith and Prejudice because our faith should affect our prejudice. Our faith should compel us to confront the racism that exists in this generation. Here's why. Because if we don't, then our prejudice will continue to negatively affect the faith of a generation who's watching us. I really hope you'll join a host of churches and families to do what I'm going to do, to listen, to learn. Because until we understand the whys that exist behind some of the prejudice in our country, we can't really be a part of the solution. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, during the beginning of the civil rights movement. During those decades, too many of us didn't show up for this conversation. That's why the Faith and Prejudice Initiative is so important now. That's why I'm so hopeful in this decade we have a chance to do something we didn't 50 years ago. Let's get it right this time. To register, please go to thinkorange.com/faith and prejudice.
We have been challenged, but more than challenged, we have been called. You are not watching this by accident. You are watching this because you have been called to be the change we so desperately need in this country. James chapter 2, verse 17 compels us as Christians to allow the works of our faith to demonstrate what we believe. So now, visit faithandprejudice.com for resources to put your faith to work. Thank you for watching.